Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another IDSS distinguished seminar. It's a great pleasure to welcome Duncan Watts to this event to give a seminar. It's very exciting to have Duncan for a variety of reasons because of his influential work, of course, on small world networks and pioneering the area of computational social science, but also because he and his students are the only pair that we've invited as this distinguished seminar speaker. If you remember, we had Matt Salganik as a distinguished seminar speaker a year or two ago, and now we have Matt's former advisor, Duncan. Duncan is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research in New York. He's also one of the founders of the lab. He was a professor of sociology at Columbia University for 7 years. He has an interesting trajectory. He did his undergraduate in physics at Australian Defence Force Academy and got a PhD in theoretical and applied mechanics with Steve Strogatz at Cornell. During his PhD work, he got interested in networks and then moved to social systems. And I can't think of a better speaker for this seminar series. Duncan, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Ali. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. Nice to be back at MIT again. So I want to talk today about computational social science, but maybe I'll start off by talking a little bit about social science and what I think makes social science interesting. Coming from, as Ali mentioned, a background in sort of physics and engineering early on and dynamical systems, the thing that I've always found sort of most mysterious and intellectually exciting about studying social systems is this phenomenon that in sociology we call the micro-macro problem, but that is probably known to more people as emergent behavior. Emergent behavior is essentially ubiquitous in social science, that all the things that we talk about as social scientists, families, firms, markets, cultures, political parties, we talk about these entities as if they are actors, as if they make decisions, as if they have properties or beliefs or motivations. But we understand at some level that this is just a convenient fiction of language, that really what's happening is that there are individual people who make up these larger entities. And these individual people are the ones with the intentions and motivations and who are taking the actions. And then all of these people are interacting with each other in very complicated ways through various types of networks. And somehow all of this aggregates up from the micro level to the macro level that we're trying to understand, hence the micro-macro problem. So this is a very deep problem in the social sciences, and it's something that we've been aware of for 100 years now. But as anyone who has tried to study such problems empirically would know, it's sort of one thing to sort of say this is true and this is what's happening, and it's another thing to do anything useful with that observation. And the reason is that the data collection, or there are two reasons. One is that the data collection exercise itself is already an enormous undertaking. If you sort of think about just a population of a few thousand people, which is not really that large in the scale of things, you might have millions of network relationships between those people. You might have multiple relationships between any pair. All of these things are weighted and directed and changing over time. And then you also have the behavior that individuals are displaying. And to keep track of this over some extended period of time, which is what we would need to do for most of the problems that we're interested in, is already an extraordinary ask of an empirical scientist. And then if you want to do more than just describe what's happening, if you want to connect causes to effects, maybe you have to do experiments, and doing that is even more difficult and actually often impossible or unethical in a social context. So if you can't measure the things that your theory is supposed to be describing and you can't do experiments, it's very hard to make progress in science. It's sort of hard to even just follow the basic outlines of the scientific method. And I think when you look at the last sort of century of social science, and often in the social sciences, we sort of look to our colleagues in engineering and the physical sciences with a great deal of envy and all the progress that they have made and, in relative terms. I think it's, it's not just because sociologists are stupid. It's that it's really difficult to test your theories and to decide between them when you don't have access to the data that is central to those theories. So we have a lot of theories, a lot of hypotheses, a lot of kind of interesting ideas about how the world works in the social sciences, and we have a relatively undeveloped capability to integrate these theories and to decide between them. So I think one thing that is particularly exciting for me, and obviously places like MIT, where you have this wonderful new institute, is the recognition that some of this at least is changing, right? That we are, for the first time in history, getting access to data that is of the type that our theories describe. And there's all sorts of problems with it, but it's something that's new and exciting. And I want to talk about two classes of such data today. The first one is the one that is kind of colloquially referred to as big data. So this is data that comes from various types of services and platforms that millions, or I guess billions of people these days are using on a daily basis. So every time you send email or you interact, participate in social media or in e-commerce, you are, or conduct searches or browse the web, you are generating a trail of digital data that, in theory at least, some computational social scientists could subsequently use in aggregate to answer questions of interest to the social sciences. So that's when people think about computational social science, that's often the kind of activity that comes to mind. Another less developed, but I think also very exciting use of the web is its ability to take the model that we're familiar with in physical laboratories from psychology and more recently experimental economics, where we have groups of usually undergraduate students in a lab testing different theories about human interaction and perception, and generalize that model or transport that model into a virtual environment. And as I will argue later, that has some really significant advantages for the kinds of experiments that we can think of doing. So when you put all of these things together, when people sort of argue about what the definition of computational social science really is, to me, I think that everything that is currently at the intersection of the computational sciences and the social sciences should count. So we're seeing this sort of emerging new field that is still very much being formed. So for the rest of the talk, I really just want to illustrate what I mean by computational social science just through examples. And I want to talk about some examples of both types of data that I just mentioned, and I'll focus on one problem area of social contagion using data that comes from online platforms, and then I'll talk about some examples of how we generate data on a much smaller scale, but in some sense much richer data from virtual lab experiments. So I'll make two further points. One is that even though the data is new, the questions are very old. So pretty much all the research I've ever done has been on questions that have been around in the social sciences for at least decades, and in some cases centuries. So the questions are very old and traditional and standard, but nevertheless, we can learn new things about them because we have these new types of data that we can bring to bear. And then the second point that hopefully I'll get to at the end is that in the course of answering these sort of substantive questions, we have learned interesting things about what can be done and new sort of methodological tricks that we can leverage when operating in a digital environment. But we've also encountered a number of challenges that I think are worth thinking through carefully as a community when we look at what we're going to be doing over the next several years. So I'll start with this example of social contagion. And this is a topic that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and certainly that is sort of in the generalized zeitgeist now. People talk about things going viral and information or videos or content spreading through online platforms, and these days fake news. And I think it's fair to say that when we talk about these phenomena, we have a particular mental model in mind that looks something like one of these images up here. And this mental model comes from contagion of the biological sort. So if you think about the Ebola epidemic in West Africa a few years ago, something somewhat like this is probably what happened, where a single individual at some point was infected with Ebola, probably from some animal reservoir. And then that person, probably a hunter, went back to his village and got sick and infected a few of his family members or neighbors. And then each one of those people got sick and infected a few other people, and they infected a few other people. And so over time, a very large number of people get infected, tens of thousands. But through this multi-generational branching process, where at each branching point, each person is only infecting a handful of others. And so this is an intuition that is enshrined in the mathematical models that we use to describe contagion. And these models were developed originally for mathematical epidemiology of the biological sense, and then were, in the 1960s, sort of ported over to the social sciences almost wholesale. And they were then repurposed to study things like the adoption of innovations. And so it's not just the language that we use that mirrors biological epidemics, but even the models themselves. So this is fine as far as it goes, but historically, the data that we've had to study social contagion, or diffusion as it's also called, has not looked like that at all. Rather, a typical data set is of the following form, where here on both these figures, the x-axis is time, and the y-axis is some aggregate cumulative count of number of adoptions across an entire population. And so this is a very famous paper by Coleman, Katz, and Menzel, where they were studying the diffusion of tetracycline among doctors in the Midwest. And they claimed that the shape of this curve was evidence of a diffusion contagion process happening under the hood, as it were. And then that observation was sort of refined and stylized by Everett Rogers in his even more famous book, Diffusion of Innovations, where he explicitly claims that an S-shaped curve of this form is the signature of diffusion, that you have some small number of initial adopters who then infect a few other people, and so there's initially sort of a slow growth that accelerates in an exponential fashion, and then as the population of potential adopters is exhausted, eventually the adoption curve asymptotes, leaving this S-shaped curve behind. So the claim is that where we see S-shaped curves, we are seeing social contagion. But there's a problem with that conclusion, or there's a couple of problems. The first is that it's true that diffusion models generate S-shaped curves. It's also true that lots of other models generate S-shaped curves. Many, many models can generate S-shaped curves. And so even if there's no diffusion or contagion happening at all, so simply by assuming some heterogeneity over the whole population of propensity to adopt, it's possible to generate an S-shaped curve. And once you introduce any sort of effect like marketing or mass media, which is almost always present in any social phenomenon, then you can get any shaped curve that you want. So just seeing an S-shaped curve doesn't mean that you can reject all kinds of other theories about what might be happening. The second problem is that historically, obtaining data is very expensive. And so we only tend to study things that attract the attention of social scientists in the first place. So you see something extraordinary happen, and you think, oh, let's go study that thing. But when you don't see extraordinary things happen, you don't think to go study the things that didn't happen, right? And you might say, well, of course you don't. Why would people go study uninteresting things? But if you only study the successes, if you only study the things that diffuse, and then you try to make causal inferences about what, or even just predictions about why certain things diffuse and others don't, your data is intrinsically biased. You're selecting on the dependent variable that you're trying to understand. So this is a very basic problem, but it's been difficult to get around just because of the way that the data was collected. So if we want to really understand how things spread and why things spread, we really need data that has a couple of properties. One is that it is at the individual level. So we can see actual individual to individual level events. And the second is that we have something like a total census of all the things that might diffuse, right? The things that have a possibility of diffusing. And so naturally, I'm going to argue that, that the web at least helps with both of these problems. And so now there's a sort of a fairly rapidly growing literature of papers where people are using data of this sort to study diffusion. And so now that we have data like this, we can ask different sorts of questions, like, well, how much of diffusion is viral, and what does that even mean? What do we, can we be more sort of precise about what we mean by viral as opposed to some other way of people finding out about things? So what does it even look like? Can we visualize it? And finally, can we predict it? And I will talk about the first two bullet points here today, but not the third. I should just say as an aside, all the work that I'm going to describe, A is already published, so you should feel free to go and look at the references. And B, I will be sort of skating over a bunch of different things, so I'll be skipping over most of the details. And if you're curious about those, I'd be happy to refer you to I would refer you to the references. So the first paper that I want to describe is from a few years ago now, and this is work with Sharad Goyal, who's now at Stanford, and Dan Goldstein, who's a colleague of mine at Microsoft back when we were at Yahoo. And we were interested in the first of these questions, which is sort of basically, how much stuff is really viral anyway? And the way that we went about this was to reanalyze data that either we had collected or that our colleagues had collected for some other purpose. So just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, we had a few years earlier had built this Facebook app it was a network survey. We were interested in people's political beliefs and how similar they were to their friends, and also how similar they thought they were to their friends. So we were interested in both real and perceived similarity with respect to political beliefs. And so we designed a survey that had a kind of game-like, gamified element to it, where you would answer some questions about your beliefs, and then we would ask you what you thought your friends would answer. And if your friends had not answered the question, then we would prompt you to ask your friends to play this game as well, right? And so there was a sort of social referral mechanism built into the application. And of course, our explicit intent was to get this thing to go viral and spread throughout the Facebook network and recruit a large number of people for our study. So the study was about political beliefs, but there was a mechanism here for this app itself to spread throughout the network. And that was the question that we were subsequently interested in, was how had this thing spread? And then we also had data from Twitter where we were looking at shortened URLs spreading via retweets through the Twitter network. We had other data from a synchronous video viewing app that some of our colleagues at Yahoo had built. We had data from a philanthropic exercise that we had helped with, where the philanthropy group at Yahoo were trying to build a sort of pay-it-forward game at the holiday season to get people to do something nice for a stranger and then post about it and exhort their friends to follow suit. So all of these things are completely different applications. They operate on different populations. The adoption mechanics are different in each case. The networks are different. They attracted populations of quite different scales. And actually, the sort of heterogeneity of examples was really the point of our exercise. Because in every case, you could imagine that the way the data had been collected was very biased and very unrepresentative. And so if you were trying to make some conclusions about how things spread in a network from just looking at the Facebook app, you would always have to worry that there was just something strange about Facebook back in 2010 when we collected the data, that it was a smaller population, it skewed very left-wing, it was much younger than the general population, and so you might say, well, maybe that happens on Facebook, but it wouldn't happen anywhere else. And you could make similar critiques of each one of the domains that we looked at, but our hope was that because the biases were different, if we found the same patterns across different examples, then we could make some robust inferences. And so, of course, I wouldn't be telling you the story except for the fact that we found very consistent patterns. So to just interpret this slide for you, if you look up here in the top right-hand corner at this Twitter example, this is a data set of about 40 million URLs, which seemed like a very big number back then. Doesn't seem like a big number now, of shortened URLs that people had introduced into Twitter. So somebody's tweeting about a piece of content that they've found, a news story, or a photograph, or a video or something, and they're posting it in Twitter, hoping that their friends are going to see it and hopefully share it. And so what this figure shows the 5 most common things that happen. And the most common thing by far is that you tweet out your interesting piece of news, and 93% of the time nothing happens. Everybody just ignores you. And so if you feel like people are not listening to you on Twitter, then you're in great company. That happens almost all of the time. It's sort of like citations for papers. So about 5% of the time, one of your followers retweets you. About 0.9% of the time, 2 of your followers retweet you. 0.3% of the time, 3 of them retweet you. And 0.3% of the time, something that seems a little bit viral happens, where one of your followers retweets you, and then one of their followers, who's not one of your followers, retweets them. So that's the 5 most common things. And if you add up these numbers on the bottom here, you see that accounts for about 99% of all instances where somebody has introduced a piece of content into Twitter. So very little viral spreading on Twitter in this data set. And then if we look across all the other domains, we see very, very similar patterns. In fact, there's 5 different motifs here, and there's only 7 different motifs across the whole data set. So we find this one, and we also find this one. But otherwise, it's very consistent. And even the frequencies of these motifs are pretty consistent, and the order in which they appear is pretty consistent. And so that led us to further collapse all the data into a single figure. And across all of it, we concluded that about 90% of the time, a seed node introducing a new piece of content experiences 0 subsequent adoptions, so nothing happens. About 8% of the time, you get 1 additional adoption. 1% of the time, you get 2 additional adoptions. And 1% of the time is everything else. So everything that you've ever heard of, every viral video, every meme, every trend is in this small blue bar on the right-hand side. So that's the first line here, that 99% of events involve fewer than 2 adoptions. So you might say, well, that's interesting, but we know from other data that a lot of these distributions are highly skewed. And so even if rare events are extremely rare, they can be very, very large. So going back to biological diseases again, about 100 years ago, the world was going through the Spanish flu epidemic that infected about 1 billion people worldwide, so about 1/3 of the Earth's population at the time. So if you were looking at flu epidemics across history, that would be 1 event out of thousands of events. But if you were counting how many people got the flu over the course of history, a much larger fraction of them would be in that 1 event, right? And so you might still be concerned about what's happening in this small blue bar because the things in there are very, very big. So we can make a stronger statement and say that there are no Spanish flu events in our data. And so now if we count adoptions rather than cascades, we find that 99% of the adoptions are less than 1 hop from less than or equal to 1 hop from the seed node. So if your mental model of viral is things that spread for multiple steps through a network, then only 1%, maximum 1% of adoptions are viral. So this is sort of certainly a result that the viral marketing people don't tend to like. So you might be thinking, okay, maybe you just didn't study anything interesting. And in fact, plenty of people of our colleagues told us that. And they said, well, sure you have all this data, but most things are just not that interesting and they're not really intended to spread. And we know that some things really are viral, right? Because Gangnam Style a few years ago was so popular that Google had to add another digit to their counter on YouTube because they ran out at 1 billion, and about 3 billion people watched this video. So surely that's a viral phenomenon. But actually, really all we know about Gangnam Style and other things that we refer to as viral is that they're really popular, right? And we assert that they're viral. But the Super Bowl is also really popular. About 100 million people every year watch the Super Bowl. But no one would call that a viral phenomenon, right? It's really a broadcast phenomenon. There's a single node in the middle that's blasting out the same information to everybody at the same time, and people aren't sort of passing it along from friend to friend. And so if we want to show that something like Gangnam Style is, or that even just popular things in general are viral, we need to be able to reject that this is what is happening and show that this is what is happening. So motivated by these 2 concerns, structural, viral versus broadcast, and trying to find content that is legitimately interesting as opposed to just anything that happens to be online, we did a second study, also led by Sharad, but this time with Ashton Anderson, who is now at University of Toronto, and Jake Hoffman, who's at Microsoft. And at this point, we were at Microsoft, so we had access to the whole Twitter fire hose, and we were able to collect pretty much a census of every video, news story, image, or petition that had been posted to Twitter in the previous year. So that's at that point, over 1 billion observations, which again seemed like a very big number back then. It seems less big now. And then to address the concern about intrinsic interest, we restricted that set of observations to events or pieces of content that had received at least 100 retweets. So 100 retweets is a lot. In fact, at the time, only about 1 in 3,000 seeds got 100 retweets. So this is already way more popular than anything that I showed you in the previous study. But of course, with over 1 billion things to start with, we have about 350,000 of these rare events. And so now we can look at their structure. And so we propose this notion of what we call structural virality, which is a little different from the traditional notion of virality, which you normally sort of think of as a parameter in a model. Here, we're imagining that there's some contagion process. So you introduce a piece of content, people do whatever they do, you get some retweets, it spreads, and then it's done. And now imagine that as it's been spreading, it's sort of lighting up the network. There's an invisible network underneath, and as this piece of content spreads through it, it's lighting up this network, and so there's some kind of vestigial skeleton that's left behind. And so we're going to treat that skeleton as a network, and we're going to measure some properties, or in fact, we're going to measure one property, which is what we call structural virality, but really is just the average shortest path length between all pairs of nodes in this network. So if we are looking at something that's a pure broadcast, where one node blasts out a piece of content, a bunch of its followers retweet it, and then nothing else happens, it's going to have an average shortest path length that's asymptotically approaching 2, as you have a large broadcast, because every pair of nodes, except for the central node, is going to be connected through the center. So the lower limit for large broadcasts is 2. And then if you imagine something that's viral in the sense of it being a multi-generational branching process with low branching degree, but branching degree more than 1, then it's going to be proportional to the depth of the network, which is logarithmic in the size, the number of nodes. So for every one of these cascades, these 350,000 cascades, we have some number that's between roughly 2 and log of n. And so now we can ask questions about the distribution of these numbers. So how much diversity do we see? Does everything tend to be viral? Does everything tend to be broadcasty? Do we see some sort of classes of things that we can cluster? And then how does that change as things become more popular? So as we go from merely popular to extremely popular, do cascades become more broadcast-like, or do they become more viral? So these are the questions that we're trying to answer. And to look at the first question, we just sort of sampled a bunch of different cascades. And what I want to emphasize is that in this figure, all of these 6 cascades are almost exactly the same size. So the same number of nodes in each of them, so the same aggregate popularity. If we were just looking at the counter on Twitter or on YouTube or whatever, it would look about the same. And in fact, even if we look at the time series of aggregate number of counts over time, all of them look about the same, except for this one down here. But underneath that, you see there's tremendous variation in structure, right? So this is the most broadcasty of the ones that I'm showing here. And what that means is this black triangle is really just lots of lines laid on top of each other. So this is a CNN story that got a bunch of retweets by people following CNN, and then very little activity after that. And then as we go from the left to the right and top to bottom, you see that these black triangles are getting smaller, and there's more and more generations of retweets. And so down on the bottom right here, you see something that looks pretty viral in our sort of intuitive sense of what viral means. And this is an obituary in the New York Times about a French freedom fighter who had fought during World War II and was sort of the real-life version of the world's most interesting man. He'd done these sort of incredible feats and had escaped from the Nazis 3 times. But he was basically an unknown person, so he was not a famous person. But it was such an interesting story that people obviously found it engaging and were sharing it with their friends. And so, so you do see tremendous diversity of structure, which was already something that we didn't know when we started looking. So then we ask, well, how does this diversity change systematically as you go from these pictures, which are really in this lowest bin here, up to the most popular stuff, which has upwards of 10,000 retweets. So this picture, these box plots are showing the bars show the median structural virality, the boxes show the interquartile range, and the dots show the full extent of the data. And so you can see that the diversity is present here at all scales. But if you look at the typical behavior, it's A, pretty close to broadcast, and B, relatively insensitive to size. So particularly so for pictures and videos. And so what we're finding here is that there's essentially zero correlation between size and structural virality. And in turn, what this means is that the size of the entire cascade is dominated by the size of the largest broadcast in that cascade. And this is what we refer to as we used to refer to as the Justin Bieber effect, because at the time, Justin Bieber had the most followers. Now I suppose it would be the Katy Perry effect or the Taylor Swift effect or whoever happens to be winning right now. The point is that these celebrities have upwards of 100 million followers, which is Super Bowl numbers, that the distribution of followers on Twitter is essentially scale-free for all intents and purposes. And so the way that things tend to spread there is really through these broadcasts. So we're seeing very little of this sort of traditional viral spreading where something has a reproductive number greater than 1 and it starts spreading exponentially. Everything in that sense is really sub-viral. Everything is dying out, I suspect, because there's so much attention, competition for attention on a platform like Twitter. And then the only thing that can sort of sustain the spread is these very large hubs. So what can we learn from this? I think one of the things that I think is interesting about studies like these is we have a long history of mathematical models that are about contagion, and our sort of choice of what to study in these models is driven heavily by our intuition about what matters. And so an example of what matters in this literature would be that we focus a lot on what is called the epidemic threshold, this sort of condition at which, below which things tend to die out and above which things tend to spread, the onset of epidemics. And if you're an epidemiologist, you want to keep things below the epidemic threshold, and if you're a viral marketer, you want to get it above the epidemic threshold. But everybody is sort of interested, in theory, in what are the conditions that determine where this threshold lies. And really what we're seeing in both of these studies is that everything is well below this threshold, right? That it's just almost irrelevant where this threshold is, because you're just not finding anything that looks like that. And as a result, most things die out before they spread at all. And even when they don't die out, even when they do spread, it's really still a subcritical process. It's just one that runs into one of these extremely connected hubs. So this suggests new directions for modeling. Not that the models are wrong, but that we need to sort of shift our focus in terms of the parameter region that we're studying. And you can also imagine applications in the more sort of the marketing world, where for many years people have been intoxicated with the idea of finding that special influencer who's going to make your thing go viral. And once you give up on that notion, you have to rethink what sort of seeding strategy you're going to use. And as a final note, I would say that as much as it's true that big data has been possibly overhyped, there are certain instances where the bigness of the data is really helpful and maybe even essential. And I think this is such an example. When you're studying rare events, things that only happen once in several thousand instances, it's not unreasonable to want 1 billion observations to start with. Okay, so of course, Twitter is a great platform for studying certain kinds of social phenomena, but it's also extremely limited in the kinds of things that you can study. You can't, all the Twitter data in the world won't help you understand cooperation or how groups collaborate to solve problems, or even necessarily how they make decisions. And so, partly out of concern for asking or designing your data collection strategy to answer the question that you're interested in, rather than getting the data and then trying to figure out what question it answers, social scientists have long been interested in running experiments in labs where you have a high degree of procedural control and you can really design the collection of your data. Another big advantage of physical labs is that through random assignment, you can really do a much better job of causal inference than when you just have observational data. Of course, people have also been pointing out for just as long that there are serious limitations to running experiments in labs. As you can see from these pictures, they're extremely artificial environments. I don't even have pictures of people in fMRI machines, but that's even more bizarre. That you can imagine that you're sort of trying to make inferences about human behavior in the wild, where we typically are not lying on our backs surrounded by enormous magnets. So artificial environment, we can typically only study pretty simplistic tasks and types of interactions. The physical size of these spaces limits how many students you can study in your sample. And if you're interested in society, obviously that's much larger than what you can put in the lab. Finally, well, 2 final points. There's, ever since the Stanford prison experiment, there have been very strict rules about how long you can keep your students trapped in the lab for. And finally, just the fact that you're using undergraduate students at US universities to learn about human psychology already it means that you're looking at a fairly unrepresentative sample of the global population. And so that's where this acronym WEIRD comes from, for Western something industrial, rich, democratic, Western educated, industrial, rich, democratic. So there's a very sort of narrow subsection of the world's population that you can study in university labs. Which doesn't mean it's bad. I think there's lots of interesting tests of theory that one can do in these environments. But it does pose some serious challenges for external validity. If you're trying to say, well, how does what I learn in the lab translate to things that are happening out there in the world? That can be very challenging. And also, as anybody who has done such experiments would know, is they're very expensive and they're very slow. So the hope here is that by going from the physical lab to the virtual lab, by putting these experimental designs online, we can start to relax some of these constraints, right? Nothing is perfect, but at least some things get easier. And so if we sort of imagine the space of experimental designs in this three-dimensional space of scale, how many people you have in your sample, duration, how long the experiment runs for, and realism, which is sort of roughly how much like the real world are these interactions, then most of what we've done in lab experiments has been close to the origin of that figure. And of course, the real world is somewhere out here, right? Large and long time periods, lots of complicated things going on. And so the hope is that we can start to push this red dotted line or hyperplane out into space. So I just will finish by quickly summarizing a few experiments that we've done over the years that move incrementally out along each one of those axes. We haven't yet done anything that combines that generalizes in 2 dimensions or even 3 dimensions, but we hope to do that. So the first one is a very old experiment from back when I was at Columbia with Matt Selganik and Peter Dodds. This was Matt's PhD dissertation. And we were interested in how social influence at the individual level influenced or affected the dynamics of cultural markets at a macro level, right? So this is a sort of example of trying to do an experiment that is a micro-macro experiment. And as you might imagine, you need a lot of people to do this. So you want to have an entire, a single data point is an entire market of people. So we have hundreds of participants just to generate one data point. And if we want to have multiple data points, we need thousands of participants. And if we want to have different experimental conditions, we might need tens of thousands of participants. And we didn't have that many undergraduates at Columbia. And so instead, we created this website called Music Lab, where we recruited people online. And they came and listened to songs by bands that they hadn't heard of. And some of these participants were randomly assigned to this condition, randomly assigned to see just the names of the bands and the songs. And others were randomly assigned to this condition where you see these little numbers on the right-hand side tell you how many downloads these songs had received ahead of them. So, the substantive finding was that the introduction of social influence simultaneously increased the inequality of outcomes, namely that popular things became more popular and unpopular things became less popular relative to the condition where people made decisions independently. But at the same time, the songs that were most popular became increasingly difficult to predict. Right? So this helps us to understand why hits are so big and also why they're so unpredictable. But also, it taught us a lesson in, or it provided a proof of concept for how you can really ask new questions just by jacking up the scale. This was not about sort of shrinking the error bars. This was about asking a fundamentally different sort of question that you just wouldn't be able to ask with 50 or 100 subjects. So the second example I want to talk about involves realism. How do we, and this is something that we struggled with for many years, that a lot of the experiments that we and others run in labs are very, very stylized. And so it's very difficult to say, well, how is this relevant to any real world problem? And so our challenge was to try to find a problem that was legitimately a real world problem people actually do outside of a lab. Nobody plays Prisoner's Dilemma outside of a lab, right? You might sort of squint your eyes and say, well, it's kind of like the Prisoner's Dilemma, but it's not actually the Prisoner's Dilemma. So what is something that is actually done outside of a lab that you can simulate in a lab, and yet still is sort of simple enough that it doesn't overwhelm you with complexity. So in the course of thinking through this problem, I met a guy called Patrick Meyer, who, when he was a student at Harvard, and was a student at Harvard in 2010 when Haiti suffered this terrible earthquake. And what happens during these crises is all these relief agencies descend on the scene, and the UN tries to coordinate among them. They have an agency called UN OCHA, the Office of Coordinating Humanitarian Affairs. And the problem that they had in Haiti at that time was that the devastation had been so extensive that they had no information about what was happening on the ground. So they didn't know where to direct resources. And Patrick had a very important realization, which is that there was information, but it was coming up in the form of tweets and social media posts by people on their phones. And so this was not data that the UN was set up to ingest and make sense of. So what he did is set up a collection of volunteers, and they took all this data and they filtered it and geolocated it and created this map, which is called a crisis map. And they gave this to the UN, and the UN found it sufficiently helpful that they kept asking for these things. And so now there's a whole community of crisis mappers around the world who are people, volunteers, who come together online and they create these maps. So this is something that we can do in a lab. And this is an example of crisis mapping in the lab. So this is data that we got from Patrick about a subsequent crisis, a typhoon that passed through the Philippines in 2012, Typhoon Pablo. And these are real tweets scrolling down on the left-hand side here of people on the ground in the Philippines who are talking about the effects of the storm. And most of them are not informative, but it's a small sample of them are describing very real concrete damage on the ground that is the sort that the UN wants to know about. So our crisis mappers, just like the real crisis mappers, were asked to filter through these tweets, find the ones that were relevant, classify them in this little collaborative spreadsheet here, and then geolocate them so they show up on this map. And while they're doing this, and they are trying to do this, as 16 people recruited from Amazon Mechanical Turk in 1 hour are trying to solve this whole problem. And because we gave them sort of fairly limited instructions on how to do it, they have to talk to each other about what's going on. So this is a fabulous piece of software that Andrew Mao, our postdoc then at Microsoft, built, and also worked with Winter Mason and Sid Suri. And what we, just sort of at the highest level, could they do it at all? I mean, this was not even clear to us that anyone would be able to pull this off in an hour. But remarkably, they were able to generate a crisis map that is actually pretty similar to the real crisis map that was created by the Standby Task Force back in December 2012 over 24 hours, not 1 hour. So there's a sort of real test of external validity there. But of course, we were interested in trying to answer a scientific question as well. And in this case, we were interested in how does group size affect performance? And there are lots of theories about that, and these theories are contradictory in some cases. So we were able to show that more than one thing was going on. Here we find that as the size of the group gets bigger, the amount of effort that each individual puts in goes down on average. So this is consistent with theories of free riding and social loafing. But we also find that there's a real benefit to being in a larger group, which is namely that you have other people to check your work and to sort of recognize that there are contradictions and then to resolve them. And so this benefit to collaboration competes with the social loafing effect, and we were able to show that, in fact, the collaboration eventually overwhelms the social loafing, and some of these biggest groups do about as well as the gold standard, which is the Standby Task Force. So there's, again, a couple of things being demonstrated here. One is that we can learn something about group dynamics from these sorts of experiments. Another is that we actually do real tasks in a lab. So finally, as I'm running out of time, I will talk about time. And now I'm going to talk about the prisoner's dilemma, which I just sort of poo-pooed as being extremely unrealistic, and it is. But still, it's nice to study precisely because it has been so extensively studied. And so this is a very standard form of the prisoner's dilemma where we have a finitely repeated game where people show up and play one other partner for about 10 rounds. And what tends to happen is that these players start off by cooperating, and then they know when the game finishes. So as the game approaches its end, one person defects, and then the other person defects, and they descend into mutual recrimination. So the question that we had is, what happens if you do this again, and then again, and then again, and then again? Does this defection start to creep backwards as people get taken advantage of and become sort of disenchanted with their fellow human beings? Or can people sustain cooperation in the absence of any of the usual mechanisms like reputation or reward or punishment? And so this is, again, a problem that people have thought about. And the sort of general consensus seems to be that unraveling should dominate in the long run. It turns out, though, that the long run is really long, right? So it is too long to run in a physical lab. And so some people at NYU who have done the sort of most comprehensive review of this literature concluded that it just isn't possible to see this in practice. And so they are able to find evidence that the unraveling is beginning, but then they have to stop the experiment. So I'm just going to skip this one. So we did exactly the same experiment as Embry et al. And others had done. And so this is an example of a single game where you play 10 rounds, and then you randomly reassign people, and then you play a bunch of rounds, and then you do that for 20 games of 10 rounds each. So this is 100 people playing for about an hour, closer to 45 minutes. And they play all of these games. And this is basically close to the largest previous experiment. And so then we did that 20 times, right? So we recruited the same 100 people on Mechanical Turk and asked them to come back every weekday for a month, for 20 consecutive weekdays, and do this at the same time and play with the same population of people. And so in that way, we're able to observe what happens over a much, much longer time scale. And what we found is surprising, at least it was surprising to us. We thought that the cooperation would collapse in about half of the time. And then we had all kinds of ideas for what we were going to do after that. But instead what happened is the cooperation went down as predicted for about 7 days. And then after about 7 days, it just stopped going down and stubbornly stayed the same for the rest of the experiment. And so this was surprising to us, and we were trying to understand why that happened. And so we looked at the individual level strategies that the players were playing, and we found that there were roughly 2 types of players in our experiment. One was the theorized type, what we call the unravelers, or the rational cooperators. So these are people who are they're willing to cooperate as long as the other people are cooperating, but they're also trying to sort of get a little edge. And so as they get more experience, they start to unravel to earlier and earlier stages of defection. So T9 and T8 refer to these threshold rules where after 8 rounds or 9 rounds, I will defect unilaterally whatever you're doing. So most people play like this. And if everybody played like that, then all cooperation would disappear. But in addition, we find about 40% of the people don't play like that. In fact, these 40% start off being conditional cooperators. They'll cooperate as long as their partner cooperates. And then no matter what happens, they just stay as conditional cooperators. So we called them resilient cooperators. And the surprising thing about these resilient cooperators is that they not only boost the average through their own behavior, but they stop the unravelers from unraveling. And so this is sort of, again, a result that we only could see because we ran the experiment for weeks. That you wouldn't even know that this could happen if you weren't looking over a long time scale. So I run out of time, and thank you for your patience, and I would love to talk with you later about everything that's wrong with computational social science and how we might fix it, but I'll stop and say thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for one quick question, if anyone has a burning question. Otherwise, we'll go to the reception on the 6th floor.
There's one hand up here, one brave soul.
Yes.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering, do you think that progressively with time, more and more experiment will be done by private corporations rather than universities, given the access to big data and resources?
You know, I actually think that it's going in the opposite direction, right? You know, when 10 years ago or so, when I left Columbia and went to Yahoo, it was, you know, computational social science was not really present in universities, and the social sciences and computer sciences were not really talking to each other. And there weren't, you know, crowdsourcing platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk, and there was, so that's why I left, and you know, because I thought, oh, if I want to do this kind of work, it has to be inside a company where all the data is. And to some extent, the data is still inside the companies, but if you look at who's producing interesting computational social science, it's increasingly in the academic world. And that's not to say that things couldn't be much better and there couldn't be more transparency and better relationships and mechanisms for academic researchers and companies to work together. And absolutely, I would like to see that. But you know, as is evidenced by what's happening here at MIT and at other universities around the country, I think, you know, computational social, you know, the university world has really caught up to what was happening 10 years ago in you know, corporate research labs, and I think has now gone past it. So that's I think a positive outcome, and hopefully we can sort of accelerate that with some cooperation between the two.
Thank you very much. With that, let's thank Duncan again.